Hello again, welcome back everyone. LiquorHound here with you, and thank you for joining me once again for another spirit review video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of malt whiskeys, one a single malt, the other a blended malt, which you don't see a lot of blended malts anymore, but that's what this is here. And today we're going to be taking a look at both of them. We're going to start talking about the Campbeltown Loch and tasting that one first. Campbeltown, given the giveaway on what region it's from. I always talk about Campbeltown being kind of like that bridge between your traditional, Highland, Speyside, even Lowland Scotch whiskeys into the heavily peated Islay whiskeys, right? Laphroaig, Ardbeg, Lagavulin. Campbeltown's a nice little bridge, right? You get some of that good peat, but it's not super heavy-handed. So I really like Campbeltown. Of course, Springbank, huge. Matter of fact, the hype train on Springbank has been taking off the last few years. It's really hard to find any good Springbank anymore. So I was surprised to see this Campbeltown Loch sitting on a shelf at $55, $60. Now, I will say when it first launched, I think it launched in 2022 with batch one, at least here in Texas. That's when we got it. I picked it up. It was okay. It wasn't the best thing I'd had, right? It was kind of like, 55, 60, it's okay. I can work my way through this bottle. But it wasn't good enough, in my opinion, to make me go out and buy a backup. 2023 rolls around. I see batch two. It does have a little more color, a little more, almost you could tell there's a little more of a sherried whiskey component to this one probably, or at least a heavier ratio of it. And so I can't remember I think a buddy of mine bought it first and we tasted it and I was like, whoa, that's way better than batch one. So went out and bought a bottle of batch two. Again, price point still like $55, $60 out the door. As you can tell by the bottle, it is in a Springbank bottle, and that's because, as a matter of fact, it even says right there on the front, Springbank Distillery, the embossed bottle's right there. This is from J&A Mitchell, the parent company of Springbank. And to create Campbeltown Loch, which I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but it is an old brand that used to be around. It was a blend of malts, and now we are reintroducing this same brand. And to create it, what they're doing is they're taking single malts from three different Campbeltown distilleries. You got Springbank, which creates Springbank, their moderately peated whiskey. Hazelburn, they're supposedly no peated whiskey, but there's a little peat in Hazelburn. And then Longrow, they're heavily peated whiskey. You take those three components, you add in some Glen Scotia and some Kilkerran to it, create this wonderful blend, bottle it at 92 proof. Again, $60 out the door. We're going to be reviewing batch two. Now, over here, we have a heavily sherried. Look at that color. It's ridiculous. This is from the Octave. That Octave is a independent bottler that buys a lot of single malt whiskey barrels and then kind of parcels them into Octave casks. Octave casks are very small. They are a little more round than a traditional quarter cask and about a little less than half the size of a quarter cask because the Octave cask is about 50 liters, so roughly 13-ish gallons of liquid in an Octave cask, and you're only going to get like 70 to maybe, if you press it, 79, 80 bottles out of an Octave. But what they're doing is they're buying, single malt whiskey, putting in those Octave casks for 6, 9, 11 months, somewhere like that usually, and then they bottle it. Now, back in the day, I used to see a lot of Octaves that were very, very mature whiskeys going into those Octaves. Now we're seeing a lot of young. Matter of fact, my local specs this past weekend dropped probably, 10 or so different distillery versions of Octave, some ex-bourbon, some sherried, some, refill sherry, stuff like that. But as far as the color, right, very light compared to this. This is Sherry Bomb. But this one is from Brackla, the Royal Brackla Distillery, a Highland malt. And there were sister casks of this available. So there was like 2 casks on the shelf. This is actually a third one that I got I bought this one at a charity function. And so I decided, you know what, it's sister casks to these. It's probably going to be fairly similar. They definitely look all about the same. Heavy sherry influence on the Bracklas. And it's bottled at 108.2 proof. Retail pricing on it is somewhere around $90 to $125. It's 11-year-old and it spent 9 months of that 11 years in the Octave cask. Okay, but back to the 92 proof. Oof, Campbeltown Loch. When you smell it, there is a lot. This is again batch 2, and you can tell the batches. Let me put my glasses on. If you look at the very back below the label, you'll see a laser etch on it, and it says Campbeltown Loch 31022. So 31022, that's the date. 22-196. Anyway, this is batch 2. But here we go. On the nose, so much of that Springbank butter, that kind of, again, that funky Springbank where you start getting into that machine oil toolbox characteristic. Very, they do these, and I think I've mentioned this before, and they're called pruneaux, and they're like Armagnac soaked prunes. All right, so they just get these plums that get soaked in Armagnac, and they're just, this has this characteristic. That's what that nose is. Armagnac plums. So to me, when I nose this, it's just Springbank, bang, a lot of Springbank. There is a little bit of a brininess note to it. I get that sometimes when you look at like Glen Scotia, the Victoriana, that one has a lot of brine to it. And then Kilkerran. But of course, this has Longrow in it too, because I was going to say the peat level is, I'm picking up some moderate peat. So if you don't like peat, this one's probably not going to be for you. But I will say that peat's almost a little bit of like a barbecue smoke. That's kind of a Kilkerran note. And possibly that heavily, that more sherried influence that I'm picking up in this one could be from Kilkerran. They did a really good one recently. But let's go ahead and taste it. Medium viscosity, maybe a touch over. Wow, yeah, my goodness, it's transitioning. Nice creamy kind of entry, feels really soft on the entry. You get hit right away, kind of like this sweet malt character, heavy with that kind of, again, machine oil toolbox thing, garage kind of funk, early as well. You get that peat rolling in, wafting in, that brine, almost like there's a minerality to it too. It's like a beach, like if you're on the beach and you use those pebbles, right? You kind of get that flavor coming through. That wisp of smoke, peat smoke just rolling in. It is a combination of very clean burning peat with a little bit of like almost like a mesquite smoke to the peat. Oh, there's some good amount of leather as well in this one. But that kind of Armagnac plum, that's like the main fruit note in this one. With that big, again, big malty backbone. Oh, it's so good. That one's so good. And to me, it doesn't, again, there's probably some Glen Scotia, I mean, there definitely is Glen Scotia and Kilkerran in it, but to me, the profile is definitely heavy on Springbank. To me, it tastes like, if I was going to guess, 70%, Springbank component, and then the other 30 split between the others. Could be wrong on that, but that's just how it presents itself. Very, very lovely whiskey. Again, that buttery malt tone. You don't find that all the time. Not even in Springbank anymore do you find that all the time. Usually they take time to open up and they'll start developing it now. Back in the day, it used to be immediately right out of the bottle. It's just a ton of that Springbank character. Now it's like takes a little time to develop. This one was pretty much right out the gate. was really ready to go. Yeah, definitely a lot of plums, prunes, maybe even a little bit of, what is that? There's almost like a, it's not quite citrus, almost like a kumquat type flavor element in there. It's very unique. But again, this just works. And to me, if you see Campbeltown Loch out there, and again, check the code on the back if it matches this one, which was 31022, and then it has 22-196. That was a really, really good batch. I guess we're going to go by the date. Maybe I looked it up online. That's how I figured out this was batch 2. But point is, really, really well crafted. The 322 was fantastic. If you start getting into that 21 batch, it's okay. But again, this one is the one to get. Now, I've heard through some of my patrons, Welsh Toro, shout out, and that dude is all over the single malt world. But he was telling me, I think in one of the comments one time that, because I think I'd mentioned it to him, how good this one was. And he said, yeah, he goes, I think we're already at batch 4. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, and it's still really good. So they are turning out some really good products. So even if you're seeing batch, the next incarnations of this, apparently they're doing really, really well. All right, on to the Octave. Royal Brackla, 108.2 proof. So much sherry. On the nose, it almost has a little bit of that Edredauer funk to this one. Edredauer sometimes will be a little bit metallic on the tone. But when I nose this one, it is definitely heavily sherried. There's a little bitty gnat. It's already catching a little gnat around. But lots of, again, this one has a ton of like Christmas pudding, Christmas spices, figs, dates, raisins. Like a, it's almost there's a heavy malt character, and it's almost like a little bit of a malt vinegar in this one. Underneath all that big sherry tone. A little bit of a coffee bean as well. It smells nice. I mean, it's only 11 years old. It does kind of have that little bit of a doughy youthfulness to it. And with that sour, it's like a sourdough yeast in here. But you have such a big, heavy sherry, it's kind of covering that up. All right, let's taste it. Oh, yeah. That to me is almost like, it's almost like if you take a young Ben Nevis and you blend it with a heavily sherried modern Macallan. When you blend those two together, you get this really kind of somewhat orchard fruit on the Macallan nowadays. This has a little bit of that, kind of where it's like pears and malt and plums and that type situation, with that heavy sherry tone with the figs and the raisins. But right away you get that real funky oddness of like a Ben Nevis or an Edredauer. Again, sometimes that they get kind of funky and weird. It has it early, kind of relinquishes at about the mid palate when you start getting into those Christmas spices. That funk kind of fades away. You start focusing just strictly on that heavy sherry. This, again, toffee nuttiness in there. Coffee bean. And there's some, I mean, I love the sherry. It's so clean. There's no sulfur in this. It reminds me, the sherry flavor reminds me of Old Macallan. The malt does not. The malt base does not. But the sherry flavor reminds me of older Macallan. but that funk up front does not. Yeah, it almost has like a little bit of a, there's a big berry vibe to it, like a raspberry, kind of like a blackberry raspberry combination in with the cherry, and then you get a little bit of that, well, not a little bit, you get a lot of that kind of Armagnac soaked plum running. It's not super drying. I like that. I think the price point's right. If you find this about $90 to $125, any of these Brackla 11s that are heavily sherried, really nice. Again, if you're not used to that real heavy, weird funk, it might be a little unsettling at first, but just know that when you hit that mid palate, it tends to probably fade off. And again, when you're out there and you see the octaves, don't expect to see, you know, a lot of 16 and 20s and so on anymore. They're all going to be pretty much 11 to 13-year-old is what I'm seeing. But, you know, they're still doing a lot of good flavor, and it just gets a little more doughy when it gets a little younger, and I can get past that. So hopefully you can as well. And I just still think they're a good value. So that's why I'm doing the review on it. And I hope you enjoyed this video review. Of course, as always, I am self-purchasing these bottles. So if you can help join me at patreon.com/LiquorHound, we can keep this channel going because, again, it takes a lot to buy all these bottles and keep reviewing. But the whole point of this was to help you, the consumers, make wise buying choices, and I hope I'm doing that. So thank you as always. Again, patreon.com/LiquorHound if you're able to. But if not, greatly appreciate each and every one of my viewers, regardless of platform. Keep leaving all those great comments. Until next time, cheers.